The silence at our Thanksgiving table was a living thing. It was heavier than the over-roasted turkey, colder than the November air seeping through the old window frames of our Ironwood, Pennsylvania home. It was a silence held together by 3 people, each doing their part. My mother, Sarah, maintained it with a fragile, almost beatific smile. My sister, Maya, armored it with a sullen defiance that radiated from her slumped shoulders. And I, Ethan, I was the architect of this piece, the one who plastered over the cracks every single day. The clinking of my fork against the porcelain plate sounded like a hammer blow. I could feel the pretense of it all, the grand performance of a happy, grieving family honoring the patriarch 5 years gone. Every Thanksgiving was the same, a seance where we summoned the ghost of my father, David Vance, and worshipped him. My mother raised her glass of water, the tremor in her hand so slight only I would notice. She told us in that soft, reverent voice she reserved exclusively for him that our father would have been so proud. Proud of the house he'd provided, proud of the family he'd built, proud of me for coming home. Home. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Home was the gilded cage I had built around myself using the blueprints of duty and sacrifice he had left behind. Maya scoffed a quiet, brutal sound. She didn't look up from her plate where she was surgically dissecting a single green bean. She muttered just loud enough for us to hear, asking what exactly there was to be proud of. A son who'd abandoned his future, or a daughter who couldn't wait to escape? The air crackled. My mother's smile faltered, the light in her eyes dimming. Her voice was a strained whisper telling Maya not to speak of her father in that tone, not on this day. It was my cue. I jumped in, the designated peacemaker, asking Maya about a class at her community college, a desperate attempt to steer the conversation into safer, shallower waters. She just shrugged her eyes, telling me she saw right through my pathetic attempt. She knew my role as well as I did. I wasn't just the man of the house now. I was the keeper of the myth, the high priest of the cult of St. David. 5 years. It felt like a lifetime. 5 years ago, I had been an associate architect at a top firm in Philadelphia. I had a life, a future I was sketching out for myself. I had Clara. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I knew without looking it was a holiday text from her. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since I made the choice to leave the city to leave her, but she always sent a text on Thanksgiving and Christmas, a ghost of her own. Then came the call. A tragic accident at the construction site. My father, the pillar of our community, the man who could fix anything, was gone, and in the wreckage of his death I found my new purpose. My mother was a wreck, Maya was just 17 and spiraling. So I came home. I told myself it was temporary. I took a job at a local engineering firm drafting blueprints for strip malls and municipal buildings, a soul-crushing departure from the soaring glass and steel structures I had dreamed of. I told Clara it was just for a little while, just until my mother was back on her feet. But a little while became a year then, too. The foundation of our family was too broken, and I was the only one left to hold up the walls. Clara eventually stopped asking when I was coming back. The temporary fix had become my life sentence. My sacrifice was the centerpiece of our family's new story. I was the noble son, the one who had put family first, just as David would have wanted. It was a narrative my mother clung to, a story that gave my empty life a veneer of honor. But tonight, sitting at that table, the honor felt like a shroud. I looked at my hands, the hands that once designed buildings that touched the sky, now calloused from fixing a leaky roof and repairing the porch steps, chores my father was supposed to handle. I wasn't honoring him. I was being consumed by his shadow. After the strained dinner, as I was clearing the plates, my mother approached me. She told me she needed a favor. She wanted me to finally clear out the old storage boxes in the attic. She claimed she wanted to make space, perhaps for a small prayer room. Her eyes were cast downward, a picture of pious grief. She explained that she just couldn't bring herself to touch his old things, that it was still too painful. The attic was cold, smelling of dust and forgotten time. A single bare bulb cast long, distorted shadows across decades of accumulated life. There were my old school projects, Maya's broken dolls, and in the far corner, a stack of boxes labeled David, Office. This was the shrine. I started with the easier boxes, the ones filled with old clothes that still faintly smelled of his aftershave, a scent that sent a familiar pang of loss through me. I worked methodically, numbly sorting things into piles, keep, donate, trash. It was almost peaceful, a mindless task that kept the suffocating thoughts at bay. But as I reached for the last box, tucked away behind an old water heater, my fingers brushed against something else. It wasn't a box, but a small, heavy metal lockbox, one I had never seen before. It was wedged deep in the eaves, covered in a thick blanket of dust. It wasn't labeled, Curiosity, a feeling I hadn't truly felt in years, sparked within me. I pried it loose and carried it to the center of the room under the weak light. It was locked, of course. But the lock was old and simple. A few minutes of work with a screwdriver and a hammer, and the latch popped open with a dull metallic groan. The contents stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't filled with cherished memories, old photographs, or letters. It was a Pandora's box of financial ruin. The top layer was a stack of letters bound by a brittle rubber band. They were from a bank, dozens of them, each one more desperate and threatening than the last. They were foreclosure notices. Our house, the sacred temple my mother so cherished, had been on the verge of being seized. The dates on the letters were a cruel punch to the gut. They were all from the months leading up to my father's death. Beneath the letters was more. Maxed out credit card statements, denials for high-risk loans. And then the worst of it, a thick, legal-looking document. It was a life insurance policy. My father's life insurance policy. I scanned the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs. The payout amount was staggering, more money than I thought my father had ever seen. And then I saw the clause circled in red ink. It was a standard exclusion clause, no payout in the event of suicide. The final item in the box was a single folded newspaper clipping. It wasn't his obituary. It was a small article from the local paper dated the day after his death. The headline read, "Tragic accident at Ironwood construction site claims local foreman." I read the sparse details, the account of a structural collapse, the heroic narrative of a man who died doing the job he loved. It was the story we had been told, the story I had believed. I sat there on the dusty floor of the attic, the silence now a roaring in my ears. The cold of the floorboards seeped into my bones. The entire foundation of my life, of my sacrifice, had been a lie. My father wasn't just a victim of a tragic accident. He was a man drowning in debt, a man who had hidden his failure from us all. We hadn't been living on his legacy. We had been living on a lie funded by an insurance payout. The money that had kept this roof over our heads, that had paid for Maya's college fund, that had allowed my mother to live her life as the grieving widow of a local hero, it was all. What? I stormed down the stairs, the lockbox clutched in my hand, my body shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it would tear me apart. My mother was in the living room humming a hymn as she dusted a framed photograph of my father. The domestic tranquility of the scene was so obscene, so utterly false, that it made me want to scream. I didn't speak. I simply upended the box onto the coffee table. The foreclosure notices, the debt statements, the insurance policy, they all cascaded out, a paper avalanche of deceit. She stared at the mess, her humming cut short. Her face, for the first time since my father's death, was stripped bare of its serene mask. It was a canvas of pure, unadulterated fear. I held the stack of bank letters out, my voice barely steady, and demanded to know what they were. I asked her why we were about to lose our house 5 years ago. At first, she tried to deny it. She told me it was a misunderstanding, old papers that meant nothing. But her eyes couldn't meet mine. They darted around the room looking for an escape that wasn't there. I pressed her, my voice rising, the carefully constructed walls of my composure crumbling into dust. I laid the insurance policy on top of the pile. That's when she broke. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of a cornered animal. She confessed, her words tumbling out in a torrent of frantic whispers. She told me David had made some bad investments that he had been too proud to admit he was failing. She insisted he was trying to protect us. The story she spun was one of a desperate man trying to shield his family from the harsh reality of his own mistakes. And then she delivered the final devastating blow to the man I thought my father was. She told me the accident was a blessing. His death had triggered the insurance payout. That money, she explained with a chilling sort of pragmatism, was what had saved us. It had paid off the secret debts, secured the house, and allowed us to live without the shame of his failure. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, and told me I had to understand. She had to protect his memory. She had to protect us. She begged me not to tell Maya, insisting the truth would destroy the only good thing she had left, the image of her perfect father. I stood there frozen in the wreckage of my family's history. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was an accomplice. She had known. The whole time I was sacrificing my career, my love, my entire future to uphold a noble legacy. She knew it was all built on a foundation of lies and debt. My sacrifice hadn't been to honor a hero. It had been to maintain a fiction. I was the guardian of a hollow grave. I looked from my weeping mother to the smiling face of my father in the picture frame, a stranger looking back at me. He hadn't been a pillar. He had been a gambler who lost it all. And my mother. My mother was the architect of the lie. The rage I felt was cold and sharp now, a piece of ice forming in my chest. She wasn't asking for my understanding. She was demanding my silence, asking me to become a co-conspirator, to continue living inside the lie with her. I slowly nodded the movement, feeling alien, disconnected from my own body. I told her I wouldn't say anything. I saw the relief wash over her face, the way her shoulders relaxed as she believed she had once again contained the truth. But as I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her with the scattered pieces of her deception, I wasn't feeling resignation. A new terrible resolve was taking root in the ruins of my old life. The lie had not been contained. It had just begun to unravel. And I would be the one to pull every last thread, no matter who or what was destroyed in the process. My father had left a debt, and I now realized it wasn't a financial one. It was a debt of truth, and I would find a way to make someone pay. Sleep did not come. How could it? My bedroom, the same room I'd grown up in, felt like a foreign country. The walls, once comforting, now seemed to lean in, listening. Every creak of the old house was a whisper of the secret it had kept for 5 years. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's confession. Her tears, her pleas, the chilling pragmatism in her voice as she called my father's death a blessing. The word echoed in the hollow space where my grief used to be. A blessing. She had mourned the man but celebrated the lie that his death had bought. I finally rose when the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, painting the room in shades of ash. I moved through the house like a ghost. In the kitchen, my mother was already there, acting as if nothing had happened. She was humming that same hymn from the night before, a placid smile on her face as she arranged coffee cups. The sheer force of her denial was breathtaking. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of the storm, ready to pretend the hurricane had been nothing but a bad dream. She asked if I'd slept well. I couldn't bring myself to answer with a lie, not anymore. I simply told her I didn't sleep. The coldness in my tone was a new language between us. A flicker of fear crossed her face before the mask of serenity snapped back into place. She just nodded and turned back to the counter, her shoulders a little tighter than before. The performance had begun, and we were both playing our parts. I was the silent, resentful son. She was the devoted mother, willfully blind to the chasm that had opened between us at the coffee table. As I drank my coffee, my mind drifted back, sifting through the wreckage of my memories, searching for clues I had missed. I remembered my father not as the failed businessman from the lockbox, but as the giant of my childhood. I recalled a Saturday afternoon when I was about 14. He was teaching me how to build a bookshelf in the garage, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and his pipe tobacco. He'd handed me a carpenter's level, its bright yellow casing a slash of color in the dusty garage. He had placed his large, calloused hand over mine and told me that a man's life, like a good building, was all about the foundation. He had said that if the foundation was true and strong, it could withstand any storm. If it was compromised even by a fraction of an inch, the whole structure would eventually come crashing down. The memory, once a source of warmth and pride, now felt like a cruel joke. His entire foundation had been a lie. He had been a walking contradiction, preaching strength and integrity while his own life was collapsing under the weight of secret debts. Was he a hypocrite or just a desperate man? The questions churned in my stomach, bitter as the dregs of my coffee. Then, another memory surfaced, this one sharper, colder. It was from the week after the funeral. I had come home from the city to help with arrangements. The house was filled with casseroles and grieving neighbors. I found my mother one night long after everyone had left in my father's home office. She wasn't crying. She was scrubbing. She was on her hands and knees, frantically scrubbing a small dark stain on the hardwood floor near his desk. When she saw me, she jumped, startled. She had offered a flustered explanation, saying someone must have spilled a glass of wine during the wake. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. At the time, I had attributed it to grief, to the frantic need to control something, anything, when her world was out of control. Now I saw it for what it was, the erasure of evidence. What had she been cleaning? Was it just wine? Or was it part of the great sweeping act of sanitation that had scrubbed the truth from our family's history? The insurance policy was the key. My mother had admitted the payout saved them, but she'd clung to the accident narrative. Yet the policy was explicit: no payment for suicide. A knot of ice formed in my gut. For the company to pay out such a large sum, the official cause of death had to be accidental. There had to be a report, a file, a piece of paper that certified the lie. I needed to see it. That morning I told my mother I was going into town to run some errands. It was a partial truth, My real destination was the Ironwood County Records Office, a dreary brick building that smelled of damp paper and bureaucracy. I felt a grim sense of purpose, a clarity I hadn't felt in 5 years. I was no longer a dutiful son holding a family together. I was an investigator, and my own past was the crime scene. At the records office, I told the clerk I was an architect working on a historical review of local construction practices and needed to see accident reports from the past decade. The lie came easily, my professional credentials providing a plausible cover. After a half hour of waiting, she returned with a dusty, thin file folder. The label read, Vance David, Accident Report. 22/11/2020. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The report was shockingly brief, barely a page and a half. It described a catastrophic failure of a load-bearing beam at the construction site of the new community center. It stated that my father, David Vance, the site foreman, was the sole casualty, killed instantly by falling debris. There were no witness statements attached, no detailed structural analysis, just a conclusion signed by the county inspector and a representative from the primary contractor, a large regional firm called Sterling Construction. It was all too neat, too clean. It felt less like a thorough investigation and more like a summary written to close a file as quickly as possible. This wasn't the whole story. An accident that kills a foreman on a major public project would normally generate a mountain of paperwork, OSHA investigations, lawsuits. This file was a whisper. It was the official version of the story, the blueprint for the lie we had all been living. Defeated but not deterred, I left the records office. The lie was deeper, more complex than I had imagined. It wasn't just my mother. For the insurance to pay out, the county and the construction company had to have signed off on the accident. The conspiracy was bigger. As I walked down Main Street past the storefronts my father had helped build, I felt a surge of rage. His lie had infected everything. It was then that I saw a familiar face. Frank Kowalski. He was an old steelworker, a man who had worked with my father for 20 years. He was coming out of the hardware store, his gait slow and labored. He had been a pallbearer at the funeral. I remembered him being gruff but honest, a man who didn't waste words. I called out his name. He turned, and a look of recognition softened his weathered features. He asked how I was doing, how my mother was holding up. The usual pleasantries. I told him I was looking into some of my father's old work for a project, and that I had just been reviewing the accident report from the community center site. The moment I said it, a shudder came down over his eyes. His friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a guarded caution. He told me that was a long time ago, a terrible day best left in the past. But I pushed. I told him the report seemed thin, that I was surprised there wasn't more detail. I asked him if he remembered that day. He looked away down the street as if weighing his words. He spoke quietly, telling me that things got wrapped up real fast. Too fast. He said Sterling Construction had their lawyers on site before the dust had even settled. They had been quick to offer generous settlements to everyone who was there, provided they signed non-disclosure agreements. He muttered that it was hush money, plain and simple. My heart began to pound. I asked him what they were trying to hush up. Frank hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He looked me straight in the eye, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. He told me my father hadn't been himself in the months before he died. He was stressed, quiet, always staring off into the distance. He said on the morning of the accident, David had sent his entire crew to the other side of the site for a pointless task to move a pallet of bricks that didn't need moving. He told them he needed to check the beam supports in the main hall alone. It made no sense. Why would the foreman, the boss, do that kind of check by himself? Frank told me that no one saw the beam fall. They just heard it. A sound, he said, like the world cracking in half. By the time they got there, it was too late. Sterling's people had insisted it was a tragic material failure, a 1-in-a-million fluke. But Frank never believed it. He said a man like my father, who knew structural integrity better than anyone, would never have been standing under a beam he thought was compromised. Unless he wanted to be. The unspoken word hung in the air between us: suicide. My throat was dry. I asked him who would know the truth. Who was in charge for Sterling Construction that day? Frank glanced around nervously. He told me I should let it go, that digging up this particular grave would only bring pain. But he saw the look in my eyes, the cold resolve that had now become a permanent part of me. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the cold air. He told me the man I needed to find was the site manager, a guy named Henderson, Mark Henderson. He had been the one to handle everything, the one who orchestrated the official story and managed the payouts. Frank hadn't heard from him in years, but he'd heard a rumor that Henderson had left the construction business altogether and was living somewhere up near Lake Erie, consumed by guilt. I thanked him, my voice hoarse. As I walked away, the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture more monstrous than I could have imagined. My father, facing financial ruin, had taken his own life, but he had disguised it as an accident. And a powerful construction company, desperate to avoid the liability and scandal of a suicide on their site, had helped him sell the lie. They had paid for silence, created a false report, and allowed my family to cash in on a fraudulent insurance claim. My mother wasn't just an accomplice after the fact. She had accepted a payoff built on a foundation of corporate corruption and my father's ultimate deception. The desire for revenge, which had been a simmering ember, now roared into an inferno. This wasn't just about my family's lie anymore. It was about a conspiracy. It was about a company that had bought my family's silence and profited from my father's desperation. My target was no longer just the ghost of my father or the quiet manipulations of my mother. My target now had a name: Mark Henderson. I was going to find him, and I was going to make him tear down the entire rotten structure beam by beam. The drive back home from my conversation with Frank Kowalski was a blur of bare trees and gray sky. Every word he had spoken was a chisel chipping away at the statue of my father I had carried in my mind for 28 years. By the time I parked in our driveway, there was nothing left but a pile of dust. My grief, I realized with a gut-wrenching certainty, had been a monument to a man who never existed. The pain of this realization was a physical thing. It was a pressure behind my eyes, a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. The 5 years I had sacrificed, the career I had abandoned, the love I had let slip away, it was all an offering laid at an empty altar. This was the pinnacle of my suffering, not the loss of my father, but the loss of the meaning of that loss. I walked into the house, and the silence that greeted me was different. It was no longer the oppressive silence of unspoken grief. It was the hollow silence of a vacuum. My mother was in the kitchen, her back to me. She didn't need to turn around for me to know she could feel the change in me. The air itself had shifted. She asked if my errands had gone well. I told her they had been very informative. I let the words hang there, heavy with implication. She said nothing more. That night, the pain kept me awake again, but it was changing. The amorphous agony was beginning to crystallize, hardening into something sharp, something with a purpose: revenge. The word itself was a comfort, a north star in the black void of my disillusionment. It was no longer enough to know the truth. I needed to wield it. I needed to make the people who built this lie feel a fraction of the pain I was feeling. My target was clear: Sterling Construction, the corporate entity that had sanitized my father's desperate act for their own convenience, and Mark Henderson, the man who had orchestrated it all. The hunt for Mark Henderson began on my laptop in the dead of night. He was a ghost. His professional profiles had been scrubbed. No LinkedIn, no mention in industry articles after 2020. It was as if he had ceased to exist the moment the file on my father's death was closed. This was not the work of a man who simply changed careers. This was the work of a man who was actively hiding. The more I searched, the more the pain in my chest was honed into a fine, sharp point of focus. This was the first step. Finding him was a task, a blueprint, and my architect's mind, dormant for so long, finally had a problem to solve. For 2 days, I hit dead ends. I told my mother I was working on a remote freelance project, a lie she eagerly accepted because it meant a return to a fragile normalcy. I spent hours cross-referencing old news articles, company directories, and public records. The frustration mounted, and with it, the old familiar ache of helplessness began to creep back in. But then I had an idea. Henderson had a family. Frank had mentioned it. People who hide often do so behind the names of their loved ones. I started searching property records, not for Mark Henderson, but for his wife, Linda Henderson. I narrowed the search to the counties bordering Lake Erie, just as Frank had suggested. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process, sifting through digital archives of deeds and tax assessments. For hours, there was nothing. The pain gnawed at me, the feeling of powerlessness threatening to swallow my newfound resolve. I was about to give up for the night when a name popped up on the screen: Linda Henderson. She had purchased a small property in Port Clinton, Ohio in early 2021, just a few months after my father's death. The property was a commercial one, a small storefront right on the marina. The business name registered to the address was The Lucky Lure Bait and Tackle. A jolt, electric and fierce, shot through me. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something colder, more potent. It was the feeling of a hunter finding a track. The pain in my chest didn't disappear, but it receded, making way for a surge of adrenaline. The helplessness was gone, replaced by the cool satisfaction of a problem solved. I had him. I had a location. The abstract ghost now had a physical address. I felt for the first time in 5 years like I was in control of something. The next morning, I packed a small overnight bag. I told my mother a client in Ohio had a last-minute emergency, a structural issue that needed an immediate consultation. The ease with which the lie came to my lips was unsettling yet empowering. She simply nodded, telling me to drive safely, her eyes filled with a relief that I was once again the responsible son, the professional, the man with a purpose. She had no idea my purpose was to dismantle the very world she had so carefully constructed. The 4-hour drive to Port Clinton was a pilgrimage. With every mile that passed, I felt myself shedding the skin of Ethan Vance, the grieving son, and stepping into the role of an arbiter, an avenger. I thought of Maya. Her anger, her rebellion, which I had always seen as selfish and destructive, now seemed like the only sane response to the suffocating lie of our home. She hadn't known the specifics, but she had felt the falsehood in the air and the walls in our mother's saintly smiles. My pain was sharpened by a new edge of guilt. While I had been policing her grief, she had been the only one telling a version of the truth. I arrived in Port Clinton as the afternoon sun was glinting off the cold, choppy waters of Lake Erie. The town was a quiet, working-class place smelling of lake water and fried fish. The Lucky Lure was a small, unassuming shop with a faded wooden sign. I parked across the street and just watched for a while. After about 20 minutes, a man came out to sweep the sidewalk. He was older than I expected, probably in his late 50s, with a stoop in his shoulders and a face etched with a permanent weary sadness. His hair was gray and thinning, and his movements were slow, devoid of energy. This was Mark Henderson. He was not the monster I had imagined. He was just a tired, broken man. Seeing him so diminished and ordinary did not lessen my resolve. It strengthened it. His guilt had clearly cost him his vitality. I wanted it to cost him everything else. I walked across the street, the bell above the door chiming as I entered. The shop was cramped, filled with the scent of dried minnows and motor oil. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, forcing a weak customer service smile. He asked if he could help me. I browsed the aisles for a moment, my heart hammering a steady, cold rhythm against my ribs. The pain was back, a physical ache that came from being in the presence of one of the architects of my family's ruin. I picked up a fishing lure, turning it over in my hands. I told him I wasn't there to fish. I told him I was an architect from Pennsylvania, and I was doing some research on an old project. A community center in Ironwood. The effect was instantaneous. The manufactured smile evaporated. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, pasty mask. His hands, which had been resting on the counter, gripped the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew in that instant exactly who I was. He stammered, asking what I wanted. I walked to the counter and looked him directly in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in a calm, measured tone that felt more menacing than any shout. I told him my father was David Vance. It was as if I had pulled the pin from a grenade. A choked, guttural sound escaped his lips. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with a terror that had been simmering for 5 years. He started rambling, the words spilling out in a desperate, disjointed confession. He told me he was sorry that he had lived with it every single day. He told me Sterling's lawyers had descended on the site like vultures, that they had classified the site, threatened everyone with lawsuits if they spoke. He told me my father had left a note that Sterling's legal team had immediately seized and destroyed. It explained everything: the debt, the shame, the plan to make his death look like an accident so his family would get the insurance money. The pain inside me was white hot, but my exterior remained cold as ice. The confirmation of my father's calculated deception was a fresh wound, but Henderson's pathetic, sniveling confession was a balm. His suffering was a down payment on the debt I was owed. I watched him crumble, and with every crack in his composure, I felt a piece of my own power returning. The victim was becoming the victor. I told him his apology was worthless. I told him I didn't want his pity. I wanted proof. He stared at me confused. I explained that I wanted every piece of evidence he had. The real reports. The internal memos. The names of the lawyers at Sterling who had orchestrated the cover-up. I told him that I knew a man like him, a man eaten alive by guilt, would never have been able to destroy everything. He would have kept something. An insurance policy for his own conscience. He broke. He began to sob, great racking sobs that shook his entire body. He nodded, gesturing for me to follow him into a small, cluttered office in the back. From the bottom drawer of a rusty filing cabinet hidden beneath old tax returns, he pulled out a thick manila envelope. He told me he called it his conscience file. He had made copies of everything before the originals were shredded. The real incident report. Scans of internal emails from Sterling's legal chief, a man named Robert Croft, outlining the containment strategy. Even a transcript he had typed up from memory of my father's suicide note. He handed the envelope to me. My fingers closed around it. It felt heavy, not just with paper but with the weight of the truth. Holding it, the agonizing pain in my chest did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a passive affliction. It was now a weapon. A blueprint for demolition. The satisfaction was immense, a cold, clean feeling that pushed the suffering down, burying it under the promise of what was to come. I had Henderson's confession. I had the file. The first brick in their wall of lies had been dislodged. I left him there, a sobbing wreck in his sad little shop. I didn't say another word. As I walked out into the cold lake air, the pain was still with me, a ghost that would likely never leave. But it was no longer my master. I was its master, and I was about to unleash it. The drive away from Port Clinton was the quietest 4 hours of my life. The storm inside me had ceased its chaotic raging. In its place was a profound and unnerving calm. The manila envelope, Henderson's conscience file, sat on the passenger seat beside me, a tangible object of immense power. The pain was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a debilitating agony. It had become fuel. It was the energy source for the engine of retribution I was now building. I didn't go straight home. I stopped at an anonymous chain hotel off the highway. I needed a sterile environment, a place with no memories to lay out my plans. In the stark, impersonal room, I spread the contents of the envelope across the cheap bedspread. It was a blueprint of a corporate conspiracy. There were the internal emails discussing the containment of the Vance situation. There was the transcript of my father's desperate final note, and there was the fraudulent accident report signed and stamped, a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Reading them no longer felt like a son reading about his father's death. It felt like an architect studying the structural plans of a building he was about to demolish. I saw the weak points, the load-bearing lies, the key individuals who held the entire rotten structure together. My target was not the crumbling ruin of Mark Henderson. He was merely a symptom. My target was the chief architect of the lie, the man whose name was watermarked across the internal legal memos, Robert Croft, Executive Vice President and Chief Counsel for Sterling Construction. Back in my room in Ironwood, which now felt less like a home and more like a forward operating base, my true work began. My mother saw a new focus in me, a drive she mistook for a renewed professional ambition. She told me she was so glad to see me looking more like my old self, a comment so steeped in irony it was almost painful. I let her believe it. Her ignorance was a necessary part of the new silence. I was building a silence, not of grief but of strategy. For 3 days I became a digital ghost. I used encrypted browsers and public Wi-Fi networks, diving into the life of Robert Croft. I was no longer just Ethan Vance, drafter of strip malls. I was the architect of a downfall, and I conducted my site survey with meticulous precision. Croft's public persona was flawless. He was a celebrated alumnus of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a donor to numerous charities, a family man with a pristine reputation who lived in a sprawling estate in the wealthy Philadelphia suburb of Bryn Mawr. He was the very picture of corporate integrity, and in 2 weeks he was scheduled to receive the Keystone Award for Corporate Ethics at a lavish industry gala. The hypocrisy was so profound, so staggeringly arrogant, it was perfect. This would be my point of attack. A man's pride is his most vulnerable structural point. I would not expose him publicly, not at first. That would be too quick, too merciful. I would do what an architect does before a demolition. I would weaken the structure from the inside, creating invisible stress fractures until the whole thing was ready to collapse at a single touch. My plan formed in 3 phases. Phase 1, the warning. Phase 2, the infiltration. Phase 3, the controlled collapse. Phase 1 began on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week before the awards gala. I created an untraceable encrypted email address, a string of random numbers and letters. The email I composed to Robert Croft's private work account was a model of precision and restraint. It was only 3 sentences long. I informed him that I had come into possession of the conscience file related to the death of David Vance. I told him I knew that his containment strategy involved the deliberate suppression of a suicide note. And I ended by telling him that ethical men don't build their careers on the graves of the desperate. I didn't make demands. I didn't issue threats. I simply showed him I was inside the walls. I held the mouse cursor over the send button. My heart was a cold, steady drum. The pain was there, a deep throb of memory, but pressing that button was an act of transference. I was taking a piece of my pain and placing it directly into his mind. I clicked send. The satisfaction was immediate and absolute. It was not a hot, fiery joy, but a cool, clean wave of relief. The crushing weight of victimhood lifted, replaced by the feeling of pure, unadulterated power. I had just planted a seed of terror in the mind of an untouchable man. For the first time, the pain subsided, overshadowed by the intense pleasure of a plan set in motion. I gave him 48 hours to let the fear marinate. I could picture him in his high-rise office, the email burning a hole in his screen. I imagined his calls to his tech security, his frantic attempts to trace the untraceable. His fortress had been breached, and he had no idea where the attacker was. Phase 2 began on Thursday. This was the infiltration of his sanctuary. I printed a single page from the conscience file, the first page of the fraudulent accident report, the one with my father's name on it. Using a thick red marker, I circled the official finding, accidental death, and wrote a single word beside it, LIAR. I placed this single sheet of paper into a plain manila envelope. I then researched the daily courier services that operated in Bryn Mawr. I found a local company, paid for their services with a prepaid untraceable credit card, and arranged for the package to be delivered not to his office but to his home. I specified a delivery time of 7:00 p.m., a time when a man like Robert Croft would likely be sitting down to dinner with the family that served as a prop for his public image. Sending that package was a deeper, more profound act of satisfaction. The email was a ghost in his machine. This was a physical object, a piece of the original lie delivered to the heart of his private life. I was demonstrating my reach. I was telling him that the walls between his corrupt professional life and his pristine personal life did not exist for me. The pain of my father's death felt distant, now a historical fact. The present was consumed with the thrill of the hunt, the intellectual and emotional gratification of a perfectly executed maneuver. My suffering was decreasing in direct proportion to his. The next day, Friday, I initiated the final step of this preliminary assault. I needed confirmation. I needed to hear the fear in his voice. Using a burner phone, I called the main switchboard of Sterling Construction and asked to be put through to Robert Croft's office. A harried-sounding executive assistant answered. I told her my name was Mark and that I was calling to follow up on a sensitive file I had sent to Mr. Croft. Her voice was tight with stress when she told me Mr. Croft was in back-to-back meetings and could not be disturbed. But before she could finish, I heard his voice in the background, sharp and furious, barking her name, Carolyn, and asking who was on the line. He sounded unhinged, his voice stripped of its polished corporate veneer. It was the sound of a man whose world was beginning to splinter. The assistant came back on the line, her voice now a nervous whisper, and asked me to state my business. I said nothing. I just held the line for a few seconds, letting the silence convey the threat, and then I hung up. I leaned back in my chair, the phone feeling cold in my hand. It was done. The warning shot had been fired. The psychological infiltration was complete. Robert Croft, the titan of corporate law, was now trapped in a prison of his own making, and I was the warden. He would spend the entire weekend stewing in fear. His home life contaminated, his professional life under siege. And on Monday, he would have to stand on a stage and accept an award for ethics, all while knowing that a ghost was holding the detonator to his entire life. The pain of my loss had not vanished. It was still there, the source code of my rage. But I had transformed it. I had taken the shapeless, crushing weight of my suffering and forged it into a weapon, a key, a blueprint. And the feeling of that weapon in my hand, the feeling of turning that key in the lock of my enemy's fear, was the most profound relief I had ever known. The demolition had begun. The weekend before the gala was the calm before the demolition. At home, I moved through the motions of a normal life, a son helping his mother with the groceries, fixing a loose floorboard. But it was all a performance. Inside, I was a coiled spring, a silent engine of anticipation. I could feel Robert Croft's fear across the miles. It was a low hum in the background of my own quiet satisfaction. My pain, which had been a constant roaring furnace, had cooled to a pilot light, a small, controlled flame of purpose. The suffering had been outsourced. It was no longer mine alone to bear. My mother, oblivious, saw only a son who was finally moving on. One evening, she placed a hand on my arm, her eyes shining with what looked like genuine relief. She told me she was so happy to see me focused again, that she knew my father would be proud of how I'd stepped up and was now getting back to my own life. Every word was a dagger of irony. She was praising me for becoming the man I was before the lie, broke me not knowing that my current focus was dedicated entirely to destroying that lie, and everyone who had benefited from it, including her. I simply nodded. The chasm between us now, an impassable canyon. Her comfort was built on the foundation I was about to shatter. On Monday, the day of the awards gala, I drove to Philadelphia. I didn't have a ticket to the event. A frontal assault was never my style. My plan was more architectural, designed to make the structure collapse under its own weight. I checked into another nondescript hotel, this one with a clear view of the opulent downtown venue where the gala would be held. This room was my command center. Phase 3, the controlled collapse, was timed to the minute. At 6:45 p.m., as the guests were arriving, I sent a second email to Robert Croft. This one was also concise. The subject line was simply David Vance's note. The body of the email contained only the transcript of my father's suicide note that Henderson had typed from memory. It was a desperate, rambling plea for forgiveness, a full confession of his financial failures and his plan to stage the accident. I ended the email with a simple question. Does this sound ethical to you, Mr. Croft? I imagined him receiving it just as he was adjusting his tuxedo, perhaps practicing his acceptance speech in the mirror. I pictured his face losing its color, the fine fabric of his suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. He would now walk into that hall not as a celebrated executive, but as a condemned man walking the Green Mile with no idea when the executioner would act. The satisfaction was a physical sensation, a cool wave that washed over me, cleansing the last residue of my own helplessness. My next target was my own family. It was time to sever the final tie to the lie. At 7:30 p.m., just as the dinner service would be starting at the gala, I called home. Maya answered, her voice clipped and bored. I told her I needed to speak to her and Mom at the same time and to put the phone on speaker. I heard the reluctance in her voice, then the muffled sound of her calling for our mother. When my mother's voice joined the call, sounding warm and unsuspecting, I began. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I spoke with the calm, detached precision of an architect reading a structural report. I told them I was in Philadelphia. I told them I had found out the truth about Dad's death. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a dead weight. I could feel their shock, their disbelief radiating through the phone. I laid it all out, the hidden debts, the foreclosure notices, the calculated suicide disguised as an accident. I told them about Sterling Construction, about the cover-up, the hush money, the fraudulent insurance claim. I left no detail unsaid. My mother was the first to break. Her voice was a strangled gasp. She started with denial, a frantic, high-pitched insistence that I was mistaken, that I was overwrought with grief. She told me I didn't know what I was talking about, but Maya cut her off. I heard her voice low and trembling with a rage I knew all too well. She asked my mother a single question, "Did you know?" And in the long, damning silence that followed, Maya had her answer. I heard a sound like a sob, but it was raw, angry. She spoke again, not to me, but to our mother. She told her she finally understood. She said she understood the suffocating piety, the obsessive worship of a dead man, the constant pressure for us to be perfect. It was all a performance, a lie to cover up a lie. She told our mother that she hadn't been protecting them, she had been imprisoning them. Every word was a vindication of the anger Maya had carried for 5 years. I listened as the foundation of my family crumbled in real time. My mother began to weep, not the gentle, sorrowful tears of a widow, but the hysterical, broken sobs of a person whose entire world had just been exposed as a fraud. She was no longer a saintly matriarch. She was just a collaborator, a woman who had chosen a comfortable lie over a difficult truth, and had forced her children to live in the cage she had built. The sound of her collapse brought me no pleasure, only a grim, hollow finality. She was a traitor to her own children, and now she was facing the consequences. The silence she had weaponized for 5 years had finally been broken, and the sound was deafening. I told them one last thing. I told them that the man who orchestrated the cover-up, Robert Croft, was receiving an award for corporate ethics that very night. And then I hung up. My final act was for the public record. I had compiled a single damning PDF. It contained the most incriminating emails from Henderson's file, the transcript of my father's note, and a brief, anonymously written summary of the cover-up. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the time I knew Croft would be taking the stage for his keynote speech, I emailed the file to a single recipient, a well-known investigative journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer, a woman famous for breaking stories of corporate malfeasance. The subject line read, "The Ethics of Sterling Construction." Then I turned my attention to the live stream of the gala on my laptop. I watched as Robert Croft, looking pale and gaunt under the stage lights, stepped up to the podium. He gripped the sides of it, his knuckles white. He began his speech, his voice strained the words about integrity and transparency, sounding like a bitter parody. He was a ghost at his own celebration. He knew he was ruined. His empire of lies was collapsing around him, and all he could do was stand there and pretend it wasn't happening. I watched his face, a mask of controlled panic, and I felt nothing but a vast cold emptiness. The burning rage was gone. The agonizing pain was gone. The thrilling satisfaction of the hunt was gone. All that remained was the quiet, stark reality of the wreckage. In that moment, watching the man who had betrayed my father's memory for profit and thinking of my mother and sister sitting in the ruins of our family home, I understood the true nature of my revenge. I hadn't just exposed them. I had forced them to live in the truth just as I had been forced to. Their silent, comfortable world was now as loud and broken as mine had been. The score was settled. The demolition was complete. The aftermath was not the explosion I had anticipated. It was a slow, silent implosion. I didn't stay in Philadelphia to watch the fallout. I didn't need to. My work was done. I drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, the adrenaline of the past weeks draining out of me, leaving a profound and unnerving quiet in its place. The demolition was complete, but I was standing alone in the rubble. The story broke 2 days later. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran it on the front page: Keystone Ethics honoree implicated in death cover-up. The article was a surgical dissection of the lie, citing an anonymous source and excerpts from the conscience file. It detailed Sterling Construction's role, the suppression of my father's note, and the fraudulent insurance claim. Robert Croft was fired. Sterling's stock plummeted. The scandal was a contained earthquake shaking the foundations of a powerful corporation. But for me, the news registered with a strange detachment. It was the logical conclusion of my blueprint, a final checkbox on a project plan. The cold satisfaction I had felt during the execution was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant weariness. The fire of my revenge had burned itself out, and all that was left was ash. When I arrived home, the house was still and silent, but it was a different silence than before. The oppressive weight of the lie was gone, but so was the fragile pretense of family that had held us together. My mother was a ghost in her own home. She moved from room to room, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. The serene, pious matriarch was gone, replaced by a broken woman adrift in the wreckage of the truth. She didn't speak to me. She couldn't even look at me. In my eyes, she saw not her son, but the architect of her ruin. I was the living embodiment of the betrayal she had tried so desperately to bury. Maya was the one who spoke. I found her on the back porch, staring out at the barren trees of the backyard. She didn't look at me, but she acknowledged my presence. She told me she had packed a bag. She was going to stay with a friend for a while. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual anger. The fire in her was gone too. She told me she wasn't angry with me. She said that in a strange way she was grateful. She explained that she had spent her entire teenage life feeling like she was going crazy, suffocating in a house where everyone was smiling, but no one was happy. She had sensed the lie, the fundamental dishonesty at the core of our family, and it had made her lash out. Knowing the truth, as ugly as it was a relief. It meant she wasn't the broken one. The family was. But she also told me she couldn't forgive our mother. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She spoke of the years she had felt like an outsider, a disappointment for not being able to properly mourn the saintly father everyone else revered. She said our mother's betrayal wasn't just in knowing the truth about his death, but in using that lie to shape their lives, demanding a performance of grief for a man who wasn't who they thought he was. Our mother, in her attempt to protect his memory, had sacrificed her living children's emotional honesty. That, Maya said, was the unforgivable sin. I understood. I had orchestrated this demolition, but Maya had been living in the condemned building her whole life. My revenge had set her free, but it had also left her homeless. A few days later, I sat alone in the kitchen with my mother for the first time. The silence stretched for an eternity before she finally spoke, her voice a fragile whisper. She didn't try to justify her actions anymore. The denials were gone. She simply told me she had been afraid. She explained that after my father's death, she was faced with two choices: a public truth that would reveal him as a fraud and leave them destitute and shamed, or a private lie that would give them financial security and preserve his honor. She said she chose to protect his memory because it was all she had left. She had convinced herself that protecting his image was the same as protecting her children. She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a profound and bottomless sorrow. She told me she saw now that in trying to save the ghost of my father, she had betrayed her sons and daughters. She had built a beautiful gilded cage around us and never realized it was still a cage. Her betrayal was born not of malice, but of weakness and fear. that was the most painful lesson of all. It's easy to hate a monster. It's much harder to reckon with the terrible damage done by a frightened, broken person you love. In the weeks that followed, our family dissolved. Maya moved into an apartment in the city, finding a job and starting a life on her own terms, a life free from the ghosts of our past. My mother sold the house, the monument to our lie. She moved into a small condo on the other side of town. The sale of the house was a final, quiet funeral for the family we once pretended to be. I was left adrift. My purpose, the all-consuming project of revenge, was complete. The satisfaction had been a temporary high, and now in the quiet aftermath, the original pain returned, duller but deeper. I had won. I had brought the guilty to their knees, but I was still the son of a man who had chosen a lie over his family, and the son of a woman whose fear had poisoned us all. The truth had not healed me. It had simply left me with a different kind of wound. The lesson I learned was not the triumphant one I had expected. Revenge, I discovered, is a form of demolition, not construction. It can tear down a corrupt structure, but it cannot build anything in its place. I had successfully avenged the lie, but I had not built a new foundation for myself. I had exposed the betrayals of others, but in the process I had become a stranger to myself, a man defined only by the sins of his parents. My path forward was unclear. I had no family to return to, no career to reclaim. All I had was the truth in all its brutal, liberating, and desolate reality. The betrayal had taught me that lies, no matter how well-intentioned, are a poison that seeps into the foundations of a life. My revenge had taught me that destroying the source of the poison doesn't automatically provide the cure. The quiet after the collapse was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the empty, cleared ground upon which I would have to learn brick by painful brick how to build a life of my own.